Hello, I'm Dahl Russell. Welcome to the Story Behind the Music, where I share pre-concert lectures after I've given them in the concert hall to help you enjoy your music as you explore more music on the internet. Today I'll be talking about the music of Franz Joseph Haydn, who lived from 1732 to 1809, his Symphony number 102. Some of the trivia, I'd say about my main source of research for this talk today was a BBC special, Great Composers Franz Joseph Haydn, hosted by Charles Hazelwood. I will put a link here in the video, as well as have a link to that down below. And of course, as always, I will have a link to the music, a performance of the music, and if I can find them, several links to performances of the music in the text down below. I'm going to start with a little anecdote about the way Haydn is thought of in broadcasting. About 3 years ago, I met with a group of male classical music broadcasters. I was being headhunted for a station before they actually had an opening. In the course of the meeting, one of them handed me a chart of the percentages of music one should be playing. Now, the study the chart was based on had been done before 1990, and the meeting was after 2010. I try to be open and just listen to what people want to say and put things together. And certainly in my own time on the radio, I have found it's really important to constantly, intentionally break your own personal routines, or you can fall into a rut that becomes boring for yourself and also for your listeners. The programming on the radio on air is always a balance between reliability and refreshment. But what I really wanted to say to this guy is, excuse me, but you're relying on a basis of structure that was done 30 years ago, before the advent of iPods, which changed everything in the way people listen to music and changed listening expectations. Online listening significantly broadened the scope of what classical music listeners mixed in with their own boundaries of concert music. Still, it was a useful piece at the time of the study to add into the thought process that Haydn was considered so popular and universally appealing that it said 25% of your programming should be not Mozart, not Beethoven, not the 3 Bs, but Haydn. And the saying was proffered, if you're not sure what to play, play Haydn. So the piece for us today is it's important for us as music listeners. It's worth knowing that there are still stations out there today in late 2018. Pardon my cat. He has his own opinions about that study. In late 2018, there are still stations out there that are using this research to some extent. And the good thing is it's a standard beyond their own preferences. And that's essential. It's deadly for a station programmer to sit on a mountaintop and say, I know it's good, and I know the best performance of this symphony, and I know better than all of the great conductors of the world, and I sit on judgment of their performances. That's lethal. It's not only personally unappealing, it's also unappealing for an audience. No one likes being talked down to. But it's what I'm saying is it's good that they had an external standard. They weren't just using their own preferences. But still, I was perplexed by the fact that they hadn't done any audience research of their own. And they had not used a newer standard or sought out a newer way of evaluating things. Of course, the capper of that meeting was a host in his 70s saying that if a new program director came in and asked him to change anything, he would quit. He said this in front of his boss, so his bags were packed. And I bit my tongue again, but I was thinking, if you're going to say that in this meeting in front of your boss, then you should just go now. I left that meeting relieved that they did not have a current position to offer me. But I also left with the benefit of having heard the way they thought about things and a different way of thinking about Haydn, a composer whose work I value and like anyway. And one of the problems that anyone has in programming Haydn is that there are a handful, maybe 6 symphonies that are incredibly well known and loved, and then 2 sets of 6, the 12 London Symphonies, better known since their introduction because they had an international premiere. But there are well over 100 symphonies, as well as other works, sonatas, chamber works, choral works, operas, and concertos. It's a nice problem, but it's an embarrassment of riches, and it's easier always to select ones that are better known. Several of these also have titles that make them easier to latch on to and talk about. The one we're going to hear today is part of his second set of London Symphonies, number 102, and that's really how it's known, as part of the second set of London Symphonies. So it's better known than most because it's part of those, but if you listen to classical music frequently, you probably will have heard it before, you may recognize it, but it's not his Surprise Symphony, which is arguably his best known symphony. But still, while you listen, if you start to recognize it, don't zone out, because one of the things about Haydn is that he was an inveterate innovator. And this is where I get to the meat of what I'm saying about Haydn today. In many ways, all of his symphonies could be called surprise symphonies. Long before Beethoven, Haydn was experimenting with extremely loud and extremely soft, and these were exciting and new and kept audiences sitting on the edge of their seats. When he got his job with the Esterházy family and walked into the opera house, he must have said, wow. Even today, it's a wow, a lavish, beautiful hall. But having come from being a musician on the streets and playing gigs and occasionally composing, he knew he was very fortunate to have a position before he was 20, a stable position alongside wonderful musicians. And even as he came in, he was on a higher rung than many of them because he had already had some of his compositions produced. When he arrived, the hall was beautiful, but not acoustically great. So once he moved up to become Kapellmeister, he asked for permission to tinker with the concert hall to improve the acoustics. He had the floors covered with wood and experimented in other various ways to increase the quality of the sound in this already magnificent hall. Likewise, he experimented with musical forms. When Haydn began his career, orchestral suites were usually a grouping of pieces under a national sound structure. So even you might have a German suite or a French suite, but they all began with a prelude and then had 5 or 6 dance form pieces, and that was called an orchestral suite. Haydn tinkered with orchestral form until he arrived at the preferred form that he liked, which was 4 movements: fast, slow, minuet, fast. He was also known for writing well for musicians. He showcased their strengths, expanded their repertoire, and in many cases often helped them in tinkering with and developing the instrument that they played, making actual changes to the instruments. So he not only had some of the best musicians in Europe working for and with him, but his generous nature of arranging and showcasing them made him a valued and beloved boss. An example of this is his friendship with the young Mozart. It had to do with both a recognition of talent and his ability to support and cultivate other musicians. They were such friends that when they both transitioned from the harpsichord and started to adopt the pianoforte, not only did they have a pianoforte from the same Viennese maker, but when renovations were recently done to Haydn's instrument, it was discovered that their woods matched. Their pianofortes were made from the same tree. His 2 trips to Britain allowed him to continue to experiment. Excuse me. He actually had a work studio within the Broadwood Piano Factory and Store. Broadwood's pianofortes were a definitive step forward from the Viennese and European pianofortes of the day. They had a heavier construction and a larger size, but also through their pedal structure, they had more volume and a bigger distinction between loud, forte, and soft piano. So they were even more pianoforte than the European models of the day. The Viennese pianoforte had a soft, mellow sound to begin with, not quite as crisp as a harpsichord. And they had pedal arms, which were moved by the knee. One pedal that took off all the muffling, so it had the open string resonance of a harp and about the same timbre of a harp of that day. And the other muffled so that in a way that each note became like a little short pearl, a little burst of sound, that it was still a very kind of round sound. The Broadwoods, again, had a larger size, larger frame, broad wood, consequently a bigger sound to begin with. And they were also more experimental. It had 2 foot pedals, one pedal that opened up this full, larger sound, the other that could be used to not just muffle, but it graduated the amount of muffling. Pianos have 3 strings for each note, and this muffled in a way that the more pressure you put on it, it covered more strings so that you were left with just one string being played, depending on how much you depressed the pedal. So this is a much more precise mechanism of muffling, and it allowed Haydn to do on the pianoforte what he had already been doing with his symphonies, which was sudden bursts of loud and then soft and loud and soft, and which audiences at the time was new and exciting. He was, of course, inspired by this, and many of his piano sonatas, his pianoforte sonatas, were composed for these Broadwood pianofortes. So it's really clear that Haydn was a man who was interested and interesting. He sought out William Herschel on his 2nd trip to London. Herschel composed popular music in London. This was another difference between the continent and London at the time. On the continent, music was still very much the property of the rich. Concert halls were in the homes of the rich, and the average person would hear music in church and then street musicians. But any kind of big concerts were the province of the rich. And it was only later in Haydn's life and Mozart's life when the rich began to hold their concert performances in public spaces occasionally to allow the public to hear their grand orchestras. And then that started opening up the door. But in Britain, there was already a thriving middle class. Think lower nobility. Maybe think of the Bennet family in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And so consequently, there was a bigger market for popular music that was neither religious nor music of the concert hall. Herschel was not only a composer, though, he was a publisher, an impresario, and he built telescopes. Haydn had sought him out because Herschel had notoriety for discovering a planet. He discovered the unfortunately named Uranus. And go ahead, get it out of your system. Say it with me. Herschel discovered Uranus. Herschel is also the one who worked out that the Orion Nebula is where stars were being born. Haydn definitely had the mind of a researcher. He had notes from his London trips filled with timetables and financial comparisons. He noted how much money that Herschel had spent on the huge telescopes and made in his telescope business. Clearly, music was not Herschel's first job. Haydn would have had a purpose for these notes, in addition to just being the way he was, or a clinical interest. The center of culture of music had shifted during Haydn's lifetime from Paris to London. London was the industrial leader, and this rare trip away from his home base was an opportunity to study, to gather information, and to see how things were done elsewhere. Now, certainly, from his friendship with Mozart, he knew, here's this magnificently gifted genius who can't keep a court job. Mozart had to make his living from gig to gig. So Haydn knew that the world was changing. However stable his job was, things were shifting and changing. Before his first trip to England, the head of the Esterhazy family had died, and he had definitive reasons to want to take stock of the rest of the world to see how things were being run. He might not have a job when he came back, and if he did, he could not just come back to his job. He could offer insights and knowledge gleaned while on this trip. These connections and interests remind us again how Haydn was not just a musician, not just willing to experiment, but channeled his outward focus back into and through his music. Just as he created music that showcased the musicians, he created music that reflected things he was experiencing. His early symphonies, 6, 7, and 8, were morning, noon, and night. They were a direct reference to 3 paintings in the ceiling of the Esterhazy Concert Hall, morning, noon, and night. And here in London, with his friendship with Herschel, the groundwork was laid for his work, The Creation, with its focus on the cosmos and the creation of the universe, which he wrote after his second trip to London, and it's considered by some to be his masterpiece. So today we get to hear one of his works composed and premiered just shortly before this work that's considered to be his masterpiece. So he was at the peak of his orchestral powers. Marshall Marcus, a former violinist, now head of the London South Bank Centre, said that while Haydn has these contrasts with loud and soft, dark and light, that he always comes back to the light. We know that Haydn was a composer with a great musical sense of humor. And Marcus notes that Haydn had this brightness. He was a great entertainer, but for those who are serious about music, Haydn was also, as we have seen, a great learner, and he provides both levity and something for those who are serious. Mozart, we also know, had a depth that could feel bottomless at times, this searing, inescapable depth. Don Giovanni being sucked down into hell as a finale. Haydn brings us back to the light. Now, some of this may have been entirely practical when providing music for a patron. You don't want to leave your patron that you have to live with. You don't want to leave him depressed or angry. But it's also Haydn's personality. It's just who he was. Everything we know about him suggests that that's who he was innately. He was known as Papa Haydn for his warmth and this supportiveness that he had of his musicians. While Mozart had known the instability of playing for his supper and travel from a very early age, and seemed to have an innate dissatisfaction and wanderlust, Haydn had been blessed with stability. This gave him a springboard to support others, and also, probably, the ability to bounce back emotionally and financially. He is remembered both as a genius, but also for being very stable, kind, and congenial. His music reflects that essential good humor, And that is a gift that we can gratefully still receive today. One thing you'll want to listen for as you approach the final movement of this work is that the main theme of this symphony is said to be based on a Croatian folk tune. This performance that I wrote this for was also in a performance that began with Bartók's Romanian folk tales. So Croatia is, the map is facing you. Croatia is south of Austria and Slovenia, and it's southwest of Hungary. So all of these folk tunes from this region were known and incorporated in music from the 1700s to the 1800s, and Bartók, of course, expanded that knowledge base. So you'll want to listen for that Croatian folk tune in the last movement, and then certainly go ahead and listen to my talk about Bartók's Romanian folk dances, and then you can mentally contrast these musical settings of tunes from the same region, these old folk tunes, and contrast the way Bartók set them and the way Haydn set them in their own respective languages and time periods. Thank you.